The scorching Alabama sun beat down mercilessly as Wilson gripped the steering wheel of his sleek black Mercedes, his knuckles turning white with frustration. At 72 years old, he was no stranger to power and privilege, but at this moment he felt completely powerless. The soft thump-thump of his deflated tire had forced him to pull over to the side of the desolate country road, miles away from any town or service station. "Damn it," he muttered under his breath, pressing the call button on his car's built-in roadside assistance system for the third time. No signal. His frustration deepened. Wilson had spent his entire life ensuring that he was never in situations like this. Wealth had always shielded him from inconvenience, yet here he was, sweating in his tailored suit, utterly helpless. He stepped out of the vehicle, wiping his forehead with a silk handkerchief. The heat pressed against him like an invisible weight, suffocating and relentless. He scanned the road ahead, nothing but endless asphalt, disappearing into the shimmering haze of the summer afternoon. Behind him, the long stretch of highway remained equally barren. He was alone, completely alone. Or so he thought. A rustling sound in the distance made Wilson stiffen. He turned sharply, heart pounding unexpectedly fast. A lone figure was approaching from down the road, kicking up dust with each step. As the shape became clearer, Wilson's initial relief was replaced by something else: unease. It was a black teenager, maybe 13 or 14, wearing a faded t-shirt and sneakers so worn they looked like they barely held together. His steps were steady, purposeful, and unafraid. Wilson felt his pulse quicken, his mind suddenly clouded with memories of news reports and crime stories. His old prejudices crept in, uninvited. What if he's looking for trouble? Instinctively, Wilson reached inside his car door, where he kept a small handgun in the glove compartment. His fingers hovered over the latch before he caught himself. "Get a grip, Wilson. He's just a kid." The boy stopped a few feet away and took in the sight of the luxury car, the shredded tire, and Wilson's obviously distressed posture. He tilted his head slightly. "Got a flat, sir?" His voice was calm, respectful. Wilson hesitated, feeling the absurdity of his own thoughts moments before. He cleared his throat, adjusting his tie as if to regain control. "Yes, I was trying to call for help, but my phone isn't working out here." The boy gave a small nod, glancing at the tire with an assessing gaze. "I can fix that," he said simply. Wilson blinked. "You can?" "My grandpa taught me how last summer," the boy explained, already moving toward the car's trunk. "You got a spare?" For a moment Wilson hesitated. He had never accepted help from a stranger, much less from someone like this boy, someone he had been conditioned to see as different. But standing there, beads of sweat rolling down his face, options running out, he realized he had no choice. Without a word, he pressed the trunk release button. The boy's lips curled into a knowing smirk, as if he had already guessed Wilson's answer. "Good," he said. "I'll have you back on the road in no time." Wilson watched with a mix of hesitation and curiosity as the young black boy moved with quiet confidence toward the trunk of the car. His fingers itched to pull out his wallet, to take control of the situation in the way he always had, by throwing money at problems. But something about the boy's demeanor stopped him. This kid wasn't asking for anything. He wasn't hesitant or unsure. He acted like he had done this before, like he belonged in this moment. The teenager popped open the trunk and spotted the spare tire nestled beneath a sleek leather-bound toolkit. He let out a small whistle. "Fancy," he murmured before pulling out the jack and wrench with ease. His movements were precise, deliberate, almost professional. Wilson, despite himself, was impressed. He took a step forward, glancing around the empty road, his unease not entirely gone. The eerie silence of the countryside settled over them, interrupted only by the distant chirping of cicadas and the occasional gust of hot wind. "You sure you know what you're doing?" Wilson asked, his voice carrying an edge of doubt. The boy didn't look up. Instead, he crouched beside the tire, positioning the jack. "Yes, sir," he replied coolly. "I've fixed plenty of these before. My grandpa used to work at a mechanic's shop. Taught me everything he knew." Wilson studied the boy, noticing the way his tattered sneakers barely clung together at the soles, the fraying at the edges of his shirt, the patches on his jeans. This kid wasn't just tough. He was surviving. Something about that unsettled Wilson. He had spent his life believing people like him, people with money, with power, were the only ones who knew how to survive. Yet here was this boy, someone who had probably never seen the inside of a five-star restaurant, who was maneuvering this situation with more control and grace than Wilson himself. The thought made him shift uncomfortably. Suddenly, a noise echoed from down the road, a low rumbling, the sound of an approaching engine. Both Wilson and the boy turned their heads in unison. A truck was barreling toward them, kicking up a thick cloud of dust in its wake. Wilson felt an unexpected prickle of apprehension. Something about the speed, the way the truck swerved slightly in the road, set his nerves on edge. The boy, however, barely reacted. He merely sighed and muttered, "Great. Here we go." Wilson turned to him sharply. "What do you mean, here we go?" Before the boy could answer, the truck came to a screeching halt a few feet away. The engine cut off and two men stepped out. They were rough-looking, dirty jeans, sweat-stained baseball caps, boots caked in mud. One of them leaned against the truck's door, arms crossed, a slow grin spreading across his face. "Well, look at this," the man drawled, his eyes sliding over Wilson before settling on the boy. "Didn't think I'd see you out here, Malik." Wilson's stomach twisted. The air suddenly felt heavier. The boy, Malik, kept his head down, his grip on the wrench tightening. "I'm just helping the man fix his car, Ronnie." Ronnie let out a low chuckle. "That right?" His gaze flicked back to Wilson, assessing, calculating. "Fancy car you got there, mister. Didn't think folks like him were the type you'd want messing with it." Wilson stiffened. He knew that tone, had heard it before. It was the same condescending voice used in country clubs and high-rise boardrooms when certain people stepped into spaces they weren't welcome in. Instinct kicked in. He wanted to pull away, to step back into his car and let this kid fend for himself. But then he saw it, the way Malik's jaw clenched, the way his fingers curled tighter around the wrench. Not in fear, in restraint. This wasn't the first time he had dealt with men like this. For the first time that day, Wilson felt something stir in his gut. Anger, but not at the boy. At them. Wilson's grip on the edge of the car door tightened. The tension in the air was palpable, thick like the oppressive Alabama heat. His instincts told him to stay quiet, to avoid trouble, but something about the way the boy, Malik, stood his ground made Wilson hesitate. The kid wasn't backing down, but he also wasn't provoking. He had the kind of quiet defiance that came from knowing when to pick your battles. Ronnie took a step closer, the smirk never leaving his sunburned face. "Ain't it funny?" he mused, nudging his companion. "Kid like him, acting like he's got some business being round a car like this." His gaze flickered to Wilson. "I'd be careful if I were you, sir. Ain't safe letting just anyone mess with your ride." Wilson felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, a slow burn of anger creeping up his spine. It wasn't just the words, it was the way they were said, the way these men saw Malik. Not as a kid helping a stranded driver, but as something less. Malik, to his credit, remained calm. He exhaled slowly through his nose and shook his head. "I'm just about finished," he said, voice steady. "Ain't nobody messing with nothing. Man got a flat tire. I'm fixing it, that's all." But Ronnie wasn't done. He stepped closer, standing just inches from Malik. "That's so," he murmured. "You doing charity work now, boy?" Wilson had had enough. He straightened to his full height, stepping forward so that he was now standing between Ronnie and Malik. "That's exactly what he's doing," he said coolly, "and I'd appreciate it if you took your ignorance and moved along." The smirk dropped from Ronnie's face. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone like Wilson. A white man in an expensive suit, the kind he probably thought was on his side. His friend let out a low chuckle. "Relax, man. We're just talking." Wilson's voice was like steel. "No, you're not." For a long, tense moment, no one moved. The air was thick, charged. Then, surprisingly, Ronnie let out a sharp laugh. "Well, well, ain't that something?" He shook his head and backed away toward the truck. "Guess you got yourself a new friend, huh, Malik?" Malik didn't respond. He simply picked up the wrench again, finishing the last lug nut on the tire as if the confrontation had never happened. Ronnie climbed into his truck, but before slamming the door, he shot one last look at Malik. Careful who you get comfortable around, kid. Ain't everybody gonna be so friendly. With a rev of the engine, the truck peeled away, dust kicking up behind it. Wilson let out a slow breath he didn't realize he had been holding. He turned to Malik, who was wiping his hands on his jeans, completely unfazed. "Does that happen often?" Wilson asked, though he already knew the answer. Malik didn't look up. "More than you'd think." Wilson ran a hand through his silver hair. He had always known racism existed, but knowing was different from witnessing. Seeing a teenage boy face it with such practiced patience, like it was just another part of his day, made Wilson's stomach turn. "Why didn't you say anything?" Wilson asked. Malik shrugged. "Ain't much point. I fix the tire, you drive off, they move on. Nothing changes." Wilson stared at the boy, a sinking feeling settling in his gut. He had built his empire believing in fairness, in hard work, in a world that rewarded those who put in the effort. But here was this kid, working harder than most men Wilson knew. And yet, no amount of effort could protect him from men like Ronnie. Malik dusted off his jeans and stood up straight. "All right, sir, you're good to go." Wilson looked at the newly replaced tire, then back at the boy. "You're not going to take the money, are you?" Malik's lips curled into a faint smile. "No, sir." Wilson exhaled sharply, shaking his head in disbelief. "Why?" Malik shrugged again. "Because some things ain't about money." Wilson had no response, because for the first time in his life he was beginning to realize just how much he had missed about the world. Wilson sat in his Mercedes, hands gripping the steering wheel, staring at his reflection in the rearview mirror. His face was lined with age, his silver hair slicked back in its usual perfect style, but for the first time in a long time he didn't recognize himself. The encounter with Malik and the two racist men had rattled him in a way he hadn't expected. As he pulled back onto the road, dust swirling in his wake, his mind refused to let go of what had just happened. He had spent decades of his life surrounded by wealth, influence, and people who looked just like him. People who believed that money solved everything, that hard work alone determined success, that racism was a thing of the past. But today Wilson had seen the world through a different lens. The boy had been fearless, unshaken, and worst of all, used to it. Wilson's knuckles tightened. The injustice of it gnawed at him, a slow burn in his chest. He had always believed in fairness, but what kind of fairness let a 14-year-old boy endure threats and humiliation just for existing? Before he even realized what he was doing, Wilson found himself taking a detour. He wasn't heading home. He needed answers. The drive took longer than expected. The road signs changed, the pavement cracked, and the neighborhoods grew smaller, more worn down. Eventually, he pulled up to a small gas station on the outskirts of town. The air smelled of gasoline and fried food, and a handful of locals milled about near the entrance. Wilson stepped out of his car, adjusting his suit jacket. He didn't belong here. He could feel the eyes on him, curious, wary. Swallowing his discomfort, he approached an older black woman behind the register. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said, his voice polite but firm. "I'm looking for a boy named Malik. He helped me earlier today." The woman raised an eyebrow, wiping her hands on a rag. "That so?" "Yes," Wilson nodded. I just wanted to find him, to thank him properly." The woman studied him for a moment before shaking her head with a soft chuckle. "Sounds like Malik, all right. Always helping folks, never asking for nothing." She leaned on the counter. "You'll find him at the end of Lincoln Street. Small blue house with the porch falling apart. Can't miss it." Wilson hesitated. "Thank you." As he walked back to his car, a man sitting on the curb called out, "What's a man like you doing looking for Malik?" Wilson turned. "He helped me today. I want to return the favor." The man scoffed. "Ain't many like you who care. Just make sure you ain't showing up to throw charity at 'em." "That boy don't take pity." Wilson didn't respond. He simply got in his car and drove toward Lincoln Street. He found the house easily enough. It was even worse than he expected. The wooden steps leading up to the porch sagged dangerously. The paint peeled in long, tired strips, and the roof looked like it could collapse with the next strong wind. Wilson took a deep breath and knocked. A woman in her early 40s answered. Her face was tired but kind, her eyes sharp with quiet strength. Yes? She asked, clearly confused to see a well-dressed white man standing on her doorstep. Wilson cleared his throat. Ma'am, my name is Wilson. Your son helped me earlier today when my car broke down. I just wanted to thank him. She blinked in surprise before her face softened. That sounds like my Malik, she said with a small smile. He's always helping folks. Come on in. Wilson stepped inside, taking in the humble surroundings. The furniture was old but clean. A few framed pictures sat on a wooden shelf, their glass cracked but carefully dusted. There was no luxury here, no extravagance, just a home built on love and survival. Then he heard Malik's voice from the backyard. Wilson followed the woman outside, where he found the boy hammering a loose fence post into place. His hands were dirty, his clothes even more worn in the daylight, but his expression was focused, determined. The moment Malik saw Wilson, his brows furrowed. You lost again, sir? Wilson chuckled despite himself. Number I came to find you. Malik stood, wiping his hands on his jeans. Why? Wilson exhaled, glancing around. Because I couldn't stop thinking about what happened today. About you. About what you go through. Malik's eyes darkened slightly. Ain't nothing new, sir. And that was what broke Wilson the most. The acceptance in his voice, the way he had already decided that this was just life. Wilson squared his shoulders. Well, it should be new. It shouldn't be normal. And I want to do something about it. For the first time, Malik looked uncertain. Like what? Wilson glanced at the crumbling house, then back at the boy who had shown him more dignity and strength in a single afternoon than most men he knew. Let's start with this, he said. Let me help you. The right way. Malik stared at Wilson, his brows furrowing as if trying to decipher the millionaire's true intentions. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the uneven yard. His mother stood nearby, arms crossed, watching the exchange with cautious curiosity. You want to help? Malik asked, skepticism clear in his voice. Why? Wilson hesitated. He had spent his life believing that money was the solution to everything. But standing in this broken-down yard, looking at a boy who had never known privilege, he realized this wasn't about charity. It was about fairness. Because I owe you, Wilson admitted. Malik let out a dry laugh, shaking his head. You don't owe me nothing. I fixed your car, that's it. Wilson took a slow step forward. It's not just about the car, son. It's about what I saw today. What those men did to you, how you reacted, like it was just another day. He exhaled sharply. That's not right. That's not fair. Malik's jaw clenched. Fair? His voice carried an edge of bitterness. Ain't never been fair. Ain't gonna start now. Wilson met his gaze, unwavering. Maybe not, but maybe it can get better. Malik's mother finally spoke. We've learned to survive, Mr. Wilson. We don't need pity. Wilson nodded. Good. Because I'm not offering pity. I'm offering a chance to fix this house, to give Malik a shot at something bigger. For the first time, Malik hesitated. His mother's grip tightened on the dish towel in her hands. The boy's voice was quiet when he finally spoke. What's the catch? Malik's question hung in the air, thick with suspicion. His dark eyes locked onto Wilson's, scanning for any hint of deceit. There's no catch, Wilson said, his voice steady. No conditions. No strings attached, just a man trying to do what's right. Malik's mother exchanged a glance with her son, her expression unreadable. She had lived long enough to know that kindness from wealthy white men usually came with a price. You show up out of nowhere, Malik said, arms crossed, saying you want to help us? Why now? Wilson exhaled, shoving his hands into his pockets. Because I should have done something sooner, he admitted. Because today, you showed me something I've been blind to my whole life. Malik studied him for a long moment before scoffing, Rich folks don't change. Wilson took a slow step closer. Maybe most don't. But I'm trying to. Silence. The wind rustled through the trees, the only sound in the tension-filled backyard. Finally, Malik's mother sighed, wiping her hands on her apron. If we say yes, what exactly are you offering? Wilson turned, looking at the house, the peeling paint, the sagging porch, the broken-down fence. A safe home, a roof that won't leak when it rains. A future for your son where he doesn't have to fix rich men's cars to get by. Malik swallowed hard, his defenses cracking just a little. "All right," he muttered. "We'll see if you're serious." Wilson extended his hand. Malik hesitated, then finally shook it. It was the first step towards something neither of them fully understood yet. The handshake was firm, but the tension in Malik's shoulders didn't ease. His mother still watched Wilson like a hawk, as if waiting for the moment he would reveal his real intentions. Wilson understood. This wasn't just about fixing a house, it was about trust. Trust that had been broken for generations. Trust that people like him had never earned. Over the next few days, Wilson made the calls. Contractors, suppliers, old business connections, he called in favors, paid in full where he needed to, and ensured the work on Malik's home started immediately. But not everyone was happy about it. Word spread fast in the small Alabama town, a rich white man investing money into a poor black family's home. It didn't sit right with some people. Wilson first noticed it at the diner when conversations quieted as he walked in. Then came the glares, the muttered words, "Stick in your nose where it don't belong, Wilson. They got along just fine before you showed up." But the worst came one evening as Wilson pulled up to the house. A brick lay shattered on the porch, red paint splattered across the steps. 3 words dripped in ugly, uneven strokes. "Know your place." Wilson felt his stomach drop. He turned, expecting to see fear in Malik's mother's eyes. Instead, he saw something else. Resignation, like she had seen it before, like she had expected it. Malik, standing by the fence, stared at the words in silence, his jaw clenched. Wilson inhaled sharply. Not this time. He rolled up his sleeves. "Get me a bucket of water," he said. Malik hesitated, then nodded. They wouldn't let hate win today. The night air was thick with tension as Malik handed Wilson a bucket of water and a rag. The red paint dripped down the steps, an ugly reminder of the town's deep-seated hatred. Wilson had seen discrimination before, from a distance, in the news, in whispered conversations at country clubs, but never like this, never directed at him. He crouched down, dipping the rag into the bucket and scrubbing at the paint. The water turned crimson almost instantly. Malik hesitated before kneeling beside him. Without a word, he grabbed another rag and started scrubbing. His mother stood on the porch, arms crossed, watching them both. "You don't gotta do this," Malik muttered, his voice low. "Yes, I do," Wilson said, his voice firm, "because I won't let them scare me off, and I sure as hell won't let them scare you." The two of them worked in silence, but the weight of their defiance filled the air. A few neighbors peeked through their windows, some curious, others disapproving. Wilson didn't care. He wasn't doing this for their approval. After nearly an hour, the last of the hateful message was gone. Wilson stood, wiping sweat from his brow, and looked at Malik. "I told you I was serious," he said. Malik studied him for a long moment before nodding. "Yeah," he said quietly, "I think I believe you now." It wasn't a full victory, but it was a start. The next morning, the construction crew arrived. Malik stood on the porch, eyes wide as trucks unloaded stacks of lumber, fresh paint, and roofing materials. Workers moved with purpose, carrying tools and supplies, turning the once-forgotten house into a project of renewal. Wilson watched from the driveway, arms crossed. He had seen countless business deals, million-dollar negotiations, towering skyscrapers built from the ground up. But none of them had ever felt this important. Malik's mother stepped outside, a mixture of shock and hesitation on her face. This is too much," she whispered. Wilson shook his head. "No, Mom, it's just enough." Malik hesitated for only a moment before stepping forward. Instead of standing on the sidelines, he grabbed a hammer and headed straight to one of the workers. "What can I do?" The foreman, a burly man in his 50s, smirked. "You know how to measure wood, kid." Malik nodded. "I can learn." Wilson smiled. The boy wasn't just accepting help, he was taking control of his future. As the day went on, the house began to transform. The rotting porch was replaced with sturdy new planks. The roof was reinforced, no longer a patchwork of leaks. The broken-down fence was rebuilt, standing strong. By sundown, the neighborhood had taken notice. Some people whispered, others watched with quiet approval, and a few even came over, offering a hand. Wilson knew then, this wasn't just about a house, it was about proving that change was possible. And for the first time in years, he felt alive.